everyone to finish trickling in here, and then we will begin in just a moment, everyone. Okay, well, good afternoon. I'm Babatunde Alokalaro, Associate Director of Member Training at HLC, and I'd like to welcome you to our third webinar in the Institutional Effectiveness Speaker Series. Today's presentation on data literacy is focused on strategies for creating and sustaining a data-friendly culture on campus. Our presenters are Dr. Denise Nadesan, Assistant Vice President of Institutional Data and Analytics in the Office of Academic Affairs at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, and Dr. Laurelyn Taylor, Associate Provost in the Office of Institutional Effectiveness and Analytics at Ohio University. You'll notice in just a moment that they have lovely matching green backgrounds for their Zoom backgrounds. Doctors Nadesan and Taylor have been working together for some time on the ideas and concepts in their presentation, and they just shared with us the other day how excited they are to present them to you today. We will devote the last portion of our time today to Q&A, so please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen in that panel to pose questions to the presenters. For any comments you have or for technical or other assistance, please use the chat function. As a reminder, today's webinar is not being recorded, so we encourage you to be fully present. With that said, I'll turn it over to our presenters so we can begin.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Babatunde. And today we're going to be talking about data literacy and discuss the basic components of an effective data culture. I'll share some of the learnings from the work we've done at APLU over the past few years, and Laurelyn will share some strategies used at Ohio University and provide some examples at the institution level. We want you to walk away with enough information to build a comprehensive and cohesive plan for building and expanding a data literacy program on your campuses. Some of the topics we discussed today will be familiar to you either from previous webinars or previous experiences that you've had. We mention them here as well because they're really important to this type of work. And during the presentation, some of the topics will be re-emphasized multiple times. We hope that you see how everything fits together. So as a background, I wanted to just share a little bit about APLU. We created something called the Powered by Publics to focus on transformation, student success, and equity. We brought together 125 institutions who were divided into 14 clusters, and each of those clusters worked on a different problem. They've been working together for about 4 years now, like a community of practice, addressing different problems in the student life cycle. Personally, I manage 2 of the clusters, the data integration cluster and the data literacy cluster. Those were a combined total of 15 institutions. The data integration cluster examined barriers to effective data culture, and we'll share more on that in a bit. They also created a tool to assess data culture called the Data Maturity Index, which we'll also introduce to you later. The data literacy cluster participated in the data literacy program with 10 institutions over 24 weeks, and we'll talk more about that as well. Combined, the 2 clusters have created a data culture framework, which is a document that provides institutions with information on how to promote data culture change. Some of this work is integrated into this presentation. So our first question is, what is data literacy? We want to level set and make sure that we're all on the same page as to what data literacy is. This is going to be our working definition today. It's the ability to read, understand, analyze, interpret, apply, and communicate data effectively. This definition is rooted in the Gartner Research Institute and is further refined by the data integration cluster. So why is data literacy important? We have been addressing the same problems in higher ed for decades and made very little progress in student success. Part of that is because our decisions are often based in an incomplete understanding, isolated experiences, educated guesses, and anecdotes, and sometimes psychological. What we think works may not always be working as effectively as we want. So data can provide some information to help us understand how well our strategies are working. In addition to looking at general outcomes, it provides a contextual understanding of the environment, about the students. It can also help us understand which groups of students need assistance. It gives us an opportunity to think intentionally about what we are doing and the impact that has on our students, their learning experience from a more objective perspective. I can give you an example. A colleague of mine noticed that many of the women in his course were doing well during the pandemic, but when they came back in person, they weren't doing quite as well, and he didn't understand why. When he looked at the data, he learned that many of them were first generation and Hispanic. And after he did some more investigation, he discovered that the language barrier was an issue. So during the pandemic, he had recorded lectures and provided notes electronically where they can go back and look at things. But when he learned about this particular problem, he decided to make those videos available, make those electronic notes available. And so he was able to use the data to learn something about the students and then take an action that will help improve student success. When faculty and staff feel comfortable using data to solve a problem, this is the beginning of what we call the culture change. Data can also be used to evaluate our interventions. So if we're looking at how an intervention is being implemented, we can find out by collecting data what the measurable outcomes were. And in this example, the faculty member was able to see that the grades for these students actually improved. So don't take our word for it. According to a Forrester survey, nearly 80% of employees say they are more likely to stay if their employer provides data training. However, only 47% say they've been offered data training by their employer. In addition, 82% of decision makers say they expect at least basic literacy from all of their employees. However, only 40% of employees say that their organization actually provides the training they need to have those skills. So this creates some challenges for our workforce. So through our work, we've identified some barriers and challenges to data literacy. One is I don't have access to data, or I don't know how to access the data. And sometimes this might be a simple lack of policies, documentation, or training on how to access the data. Another is I don't know what the data mean. And there's no easily accessible and understandable definitions, perhaps, or maybe they just need to know how to use the data more effectively. And one option is I don't know what to do with the data. And this is really typical basic data literacy. Once the correct data are in the hands of the folks who need them, teaching them how to analyze the data and apply the data to a specific problem is a skill that they need to develop.
So in my work, I've often found that sometimes people look at data like there's a pop quiz coming. They think that they should be able to look at a graph and it's supposed to immediately tell them what to do. And so they shut down instead of actually exploring and working with the data. But creating a data literate culture also means teaching decision makers at all levels of the institution how to use data. And for some, this can be really intimidating when you've not had data available or you haven't had it available to you in an easy to digest format. And here I am looking at you, long PDF of numbers in a table. It can be really difficult to know how to look at data, to glean insights, or how to incorporate that into your decision making. Teaching users that analytics and the use of data is a process, not a number or a singular right answer, can really help reduce their anxiety. At Ohio University, when we talk about data literacy, we use a 5-step framework, which includes asking the right question, finding or selecting the right data, interpreting what you've learned, and iterating if needed to answer additional questions. And finally, communicating those results to others for informed decision making.
So this is really good advice for an individual incorporating data literacy into the data culture. But one data literate person is not enough to change the culture. A culture of evidence is where faculty and staff consistently answer questions with data, discovering insights, sharing findings, taking action, and seeing what the impact is. So how do we get there? We will identify components of an effective data culture and share with you strategies on how to address each of these components. The theoretical basis is change management, where we want to understand the issue, who's impacted, what's the context, explore some solutions, implement changes, and communication to stakeholders is really important, but also celebrating the successes and promoting data literacy.
So how can you start to build data literacy into your culture? At the organizational level, you can start to build communities of practice at multiple levels of your organization. At Ohio, we have several stakeholder groups that I'll discuss later. You can also encourage managers and leaders to require data for decision making. When decisions need to be made or strategies reviewed, can you ask people to review the data in advance and come prepared for a data review to start the meeting? We also remind people that this is a great way to generate clear evidence of the use of data in decision making and strategic and integrated planning, which I'll also discuss later. Depending on your institutional effectiveness processes, such as academic program reviews, can you do required yearly updates where programs review metrics? Can you have them add early or middle stage indicators? Do they all have targets or goals and internal and external benchmarks that they're trying to reach? And can you help departments or areas mature in these review processes? You could also host data summits with rotating topic areas so that everyone can learn how other units are using data in their decision making. And finally, think about how you can cultivate and support your data champions at all levels of the institution. The goal of any data literacy program is to help our stakeholders move up the analytic maturity curve so that they and we as an institution can move from using data in hindsight with post-mortem analyses to using predictive and prescriptive analytics to give us foresight to help us optimize our students' experiences and our operations.
So how do you know where you are? The primary reason to assess your data culture is to learn where the gaps are in your data culture. We want to identify some strengths and weaknesses on campus and use that information to set goals to make changes or improve the culture. To do this, you want to identify a cross-functional group of stakeholders, ask them what they think. You can use an assessment tool, and we'll describe one in a minute, the Data Maturity Index. Or you can just do a listening tour and ask questions. But the idea is that you're going to gather information and then have a conversation with your stakeholders and identify what the common needs are and what the priorities are. It is a good idea to connect these priorities with the broader strategic goals for the institution. This will increase the likelihood that your senior leaders will get on board and provide support. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Data Maturity Index, which is the assessment tool mentioned earlier that the Data Integration Cluster created. It's called the Data Maturity Index, and it's made up of 23 questions that are organized in 7 components: data governance, data collection, data quality, data analysis, data dissemination, culture and application, and then evaluation. So in terms of gathering the results of this, we implemented this for 15 institutions in the 2 clusters I talked about. They brought together a cross-functional group of stakeholders on their campuses and completed the DMI. With over 200 individuals, we aggregated the information. And remember, we're looking for strengths and opportunities for change. And we did have a conversation to identify some priorities. So for the collective 200 individuals, some of the strengths identified were that they did have data leaders who valued data on their campus. And they did feel like they had a data governance structure that supported the use of data. The opportunities that we identified were data training. Many folks felt that they did not have the training opportunities that they really needed, or they didn't have data definitions easily accessible to them. One of the recommendations I would make is, as you're looking at results, is to identify them in 3 areas: data management, the data infrastructure, and the data training. The results of the survey may indicate to you what some of the barriers are in your data literate culture. So, common barriers to an effective culture. According to some of the work that we've done, and this has been validated by a Gates-funded project called the Intermediaries for Scale, these are the biggest barriers to data literacy, and they include access. Do faculty and staff have access to the data they need? Training, who teaches them how to use the data? And is this training easily accessible? Definitions, what are the definitions? Where are the definitions? And then finally, data overload, because we've all suffered from data paralysis, and it's a growing problem. And we need to help our faculty and staff overcome their fear of data. And so one of the principles there is just to keep it simple. Faculty and staff need easy access to accurate, timely, and valuable data.
So at Ohio University, we have certainly run into barriers. As Denise mentioned here, there are lots of common barriers to data use and the development of data culture, and I am pretty sure that we've actually hit them all. But if we're going to move to a more data literate culture, we have to understand why we aren't using data right now. First, time and resources. I don't think anyone is surprised that this is usually the biggest challenge that you're going to face. For a long time now, and particularly during and post-pandemic, we've been asked to do more with less at all levels of the institution. There are a lot of competing priorities that are demanding people's time and resources, and really understanding what data are saying takes time to work with the data. And that's after the time and resources it takes to actually develop the data product. Another common barrier at our institutions are our siloed data systems, or as we prefer to call them, our cylinders of excellence. And technology, the technology deficit, which develops because of the increasing pace of change and underinvestment in our systems and our data architecture. And finally, it's really hard to be literate when everyone is speaking a different language. Developing a common understanding of the data, and importantly, data definitions and data governance, are a foundational building block of data literacy and a data literate culture. So these are the general components of an effective data culture. Infrastructure, tools, and barriers tend to relate to structures and foundational components that are needed in order to promote the use of data. The data, the definitions, the data management, and the training all relate to the content needed to use the data effectively. However, stakeholders, leadership, culture, team are really more about the environment, and that's a really important part of creating a data-informed culture. It's important to identify barriers to the data culture before you build a plan of action.
I would say that if I had to pick where to start, I would start with the culture, the leadership, and the stakeholders. Getting buy-in from your leaders, getting champions and stakeholders involved is really critical. And then secondly, the data management and the infrastructure. So speaking of data management, I personally believe everyone needs to understand how everything is interconnected when it comes to data. Data does need to be secured, but it also needs to be accessible. And it's typically up to your information technology CIO to make some decisions on what the balance is there. You don't want to bypass IT because you may put the institution at risk if there is data that's being collected but not secured. There are subject matter experts who may decide who should access the data, but it's still up to IT to build the access procedures into the infrastructure. So when someone leaves, that access is removed across all access points. In addition, the tools that are used to store, retrieve, export, and report data are typically acquired, installed, maintained, and updated by IT. That's a big job that you don't want to distribute across the university. So IT is an important stakeholder in this process. They're responsible for integrating these systems so that it appears relatively seamless to users. So I have this lovely picture here, and this is just an example of what a campus data infrastructure might look like. In the first column, we have source systems, and these are systems that typically collect data about students, faculty, or staff. This would include your student information, your system, the customer relations management system. You might have personnel data, housing data, lots of places where data are collected. In the second column, we're describing the data storage options that are not in the original source system. Many institutions have a data warehouse that integrates different source systems, or a data lake. A data warehouse typically standardizes data so that everyone is using commonly defined data set, whereas a data lake, on the other hand, might be less refined data. In addition, some individuals will store data, we all know this, in Excel spreadsheets on their local hard drive and use that for reporting, which is not always a good thing because the data doesn't get updated and it really can't be validated. The third column is for reporting and analysis. The enterprise reporting platform, or ERP, often accesses the data warehouse, but it could also sit on top of a source system. And typically the reports from these tools are designed to provide useful and meaningful data. There are reporting tools that can push out reports as opposed to requiring individuals to go in and access the reports. And sometimes the source systems have their own reporting capabilities, but often they're kind of limited. If you have a data lake with unstructured data, those data might be accessed by your data scientists or folks who have more sophisticated analytic tools that can clean, transform, and analyze the data. Whatever the tools or systems are available on your campus, these structures should be described and shared with your campus community, particularly your data working group, with instructions on how end users can access the data.
So at Ohio University, we have 3 self-service reporting systems. We have public website embedded dashboards using Tableau Public, particularly around student outcomes, survey results, diversity information. We also have our Oracle Business Intelligence, and that is our official reporting data for state and federal reporting. And all faculty and staff have access to a variety of reports that run off of that system. And then finally, we have our analytics and decision support platform, which is a Tableau server with analytic transactional data. This system has limited license available. It has required mandatory training and the signing of a terms of use document to gain access to it.
So the second portion of data management is Data quality definitions and roles. The data quality is really important to building trust in the data. Many of us have heard garbage in, garbage out, but garbage doesn't create trust. As a result, it's important to know who's responsible for data quality for each of the different data areas. Definitions should be agreed upon and available through a central resource. Sometimes this takes a little bit of work and a coordinated effort. Definitions may change over time. You may have multiple definitions for a single variable. So having a resource where all of that is clarified is really, really helpful. It also creates some transparency and trust with the data. It takes a village to raise the data culture. So clarity in the roles and responsibilities needs to be a priority. And so we'll talk more about this as we talk about data governance. So what is data governance? It's the organizational bodies, roles, processes, policies, and standards that ensure the quality and security of the data collected and used by the institution to support information-related decisions. This definition was originally derived from Gartner research, but it's also presented here in more simplified terms as it's been vetted through our respective clusters. I see data governance really as the who, what, where, when, and how of data management. And that is why when it comes to data, your end users need to have access to reliable, accurate, trustworthy data that they can use. And data governance is really designed to break down silos and create a structure where we work together to ensure that trust in the data. So there are policies, practices, and controls, and that's how we do this. We create these policies and controls to train users on how to access and analyze the data. We show them how to secure the data. We share information about underlying system architecture, as we've described earlier. And we create transparent policies, practices, and documentations that tell them where do users get access? Where do they go when they have a question? Where is the documentation? How often are the data updated? And what do you do when the system is down? So some of this has been repeated, I think, in previous webinars that you've seen, but the roles and responsibilities and the who is really important. Typically, you have people on campus who are either consumers or producers of data. Either way, all of your users need to be familiar with FERPA. These are federal guidelines that tell us how and when faculty, staff, and student data can be shared and for what purposes. Our consumers on campus, our consumers on campus really just want clean, accurate data to use. Those who collect the data are also responsible for its quality, although they are producers. Those who move data from one system to another are also part of the production crew. Those who create the reports that end users are going to be looking at are also producers. There are multiple people involved with the data management, and everyone needs to understand what their role is and what everyone else's role is for the entire ecosystem to be functional. However, it is best to have someone as the point person, and that would typically be a chief data officer, the head of IR, or the data governance lead. And so you may have already some information about what a chief data officer is, and hopefully it's consistent from all the different things you've heard, but a good communicator, a good organizer, and someone who can get people on board. The data governance committee would be made up of individuals who represent different parts of the campus, such as legal, IT, IR, the registrar, faculty affairs, chairs, deans, advising, etc. And so again, each of these individuals need to know what their roles are and what they're bringing to the table. The data stewards are a particularly important group to identify because they're the ones that are responsible for collecting and keeping the data on a specific topic or area. The question always comes up, who owns the data? And in my view, it's the institution that owns the data, not an individual. But we do have individuals who are stewards of the data. And these stewards are responsible for the quality and the completeness of the data they collect. So, for example, enrollment data might be collected by the registrar's office, and so the registrar would be responsible for that. So to kind of wrap up our conversation around governance, our goal here is to really break down silos and create a structure where we work together to ensure that we can trust the data. Be clear with your committee on what the North Star, the goal is. You want to get buy-in from your senior leaders, your champions, IT, and IR. Those are the legs of this foundational stool. You can create an organizational structure, so everyone will understand who the chief data officer reports to, who's the senior leader who owns this process, who are your champions, who are your stakeholders. It's good also to have a communication plan. How often are you going to communicate out to your stakeholders or your leaders? And then a roadmap that describes who, what, where, when, why, and how. And then have documentation of all your policies and processes and roles.
So at Ohio University, we're still working on building more robust data governance. Our vision for data governance is to create and maintain a robust, open, and integrated data environment, which provides the capacity for accurate and timely decision support to university stakeholders, both internal and external. But I'll be honest, the open and integrated part is sometimes an aspirational statement. In addition, we've agreed to a set of guiding principles to help us guide our data governance decisions. And our principles include openness, stewardship, accountability, a culture of change, agility, and finally, consistency. And wait, didn't we see this slide before? And yes, we actually did, because the exact same barriers that impact your ability to develop a culture of data literacy are also the barriers to your data governance efforts. And you'll need to think about how to overcome them to create and operationalize good data governance.
So once you have a relatively stable governance structure, even if it's not complete, you can start exploring training. And there are two types of training, tools and data. Tool training is really pretty basic and can be done with videos, but data training is a bit more complex and requires more critical thinking. You have to know your question and even the context of the question. You want to interrogate the data a bit. Does it fit? What are the limitations of the data? If you don't know these questions, you may need to talk to a subject matter expert. So I know you guys have been exposed to the Data Literacy Institute in a previous webinar, so I'm just going to briefly mention from APLU's experience, we had 10 institutions that participated in 2 cohorts. Each cohort had 5 institutions. Each institution recruited 20 participants, and in total we had 100 participants per cohort. And each institution with their participants participated in the program over the course of 24 weeks, total of 96 hours. It was a lot. So I'm just going to go through what I think the most important parts of the Data Literacy Institute were. The leadership. So the project lead really was a key part, because this had to be someone who was influential, respected, and a good communicator and collaborator. That person needed to recruit 1 or 2 champions on their campus who are senior leaders, and that in that case it might have included the president. So the senior leader, APLU actually did some outreach to each of the presidents at our institutions to engage their buy-in early on, and I think that helped improve the success of the program. Sometimes that president was involved and sometimes they were less involved, and we found that it's really important to know what challenges they're facing, like where they are, and manage your expectations around that. But either way, it's important to make a case for building a data culture. What is the value? What are they going to get out of it? What is the investment? What are we asking of them? And what do you need? What are the specific things we need in order to make this successful? And emphasize how this connects with their institutional goals and the overall strategic plan. The second component of the DLI is that we wanted a cross-functional group of participants. So we got folks who were provosts, associate provosts, assistant provosts, deans, chairs, faculty, student affairs, registrar. Not everybody in every group, but we had a pretty diverse group of participants. They worked in small groups to solve just one problem. And it was really fascinating because they were so enthusiastic about working with folks that they don't typically work with. And, you know, as in terms of promoting data literacy, we wanted to leverage that success across not just the one campus, but across all of the campuses.
So when you're starting to build a data culture on campus, it really helps to start thinking about how to build this coalition of people at all level of your institutions so that they can help. And you might want to think very broadly about your stakeholder groups. Who will benefit from increased access to and understanding of the data? Who's doing work that can be enhanced by actionable insights gleaned from the data? And do you have data stewards and managers who want to promote data use and data access? Or do you have data owners that really would rather shut down data access and are overly concerned about people might misuse the data? And of course, you also have to consider your executive decision makers. Who makes the decisions and how can you get them to require data in decision making? Who has the resources to support your data efforts? And finally, you don't have to do all of the work. Think about others who your executives trust and listen to and make your case to them and ask for their support. At Ohio University, some of the groups we involved when implementing our analytics initiative included academic decision makers, our senior leaders and executives, our data and reporting user group. And of course, you can't be successful in any data literacy work without involving your functional offices, such as the registrar's office, financial aid, and admissions. So how do you actually start to build those communities of practice? At Ohio, we have several user groups that help us. First is our data and reporting user group, or our drug group. Here we can give comprehensive updates on what's new and both review what data are available and also how to use them appropriately. We can also review how we process data requests to show people how to answer their questions using existing data. We also sometimes have a Data Nerd of the Month presentation where someone presents how they're actually using our data in their job for decision support. And additionally, for our analytics and decision support platform, we have 2 user groups for 2 different levels of access.
I love the thought of data and drugs in the same space. That really kind of goes well together. So for the Data Literacy Institute, once you have your stakeholders in your working group, the actual practicum that they worked on, each working group selected an issue that they addressed. Now, we typically encourage them to get a problem that was connected to the strategic goals of the institution. However, some of them, the president or the provost actually told them what problem they needed to work on. And we thought that was really good in terms of getting buy-in and engagement from senior leaders. Whatever issue they picked, they had to clearly define what the question was that they were going to address. Then they had to work with IR, or if they already had access, they needed to get the data. And once they had the data, they worked on interrogating the data. Is it accurate? Is it trustworthy? And we encourage them not to just get outcomes data, but also collect data to understand the context. In terms of analysis, they actually did get some lecture and training on doing statistical analysis. Not heavy stuff, but, doing some light analytical work. We encourage folks that if you need help with doing the analysis, be clear about what your question is, but then go ask for help on doing the actual statistics. Once you've done that, then it's time to look at your results and identify what are the insights. And to do this, we encourage tapping that community of practice. We want to bring in different points of view. Would it be appropriate to include a student view if the question is there? Have a conversation about the data with different types of people and see how the results are sitting. Then draw your conclusions based on these conversations. What evidence do you have for improvement? Point that out in your discussions and explore recommendations for change.
So here, I often run into issues on campus where people think that generating clear documentary evidence for accreditation purposes is going to be a big time-consuming burden. And they're like, well, we use data. We know we do this, but we don't have any evidence for it. And so we try to remind people and actually give them a template where it can just be as simple as answering a few key questions in the minutes of their meeting, or if they're making a curricular change request to the University Curricular Council. Or they can just write a short summary paragraph that basically answers these questions, right? When did you meet? Who was there? What data were reviewed? What insights were identified? What decisions were made? What actions will be taken? And how will you assess the success of those actions? They can even record all of their meetings for an entire academic year in one document, and then boom, they're done.
Okay. So once you have your findings and you have evidence for change, you want to share that. We talked about vetting it with the community of practice, but you want to communicate those conclusions and the recommendations. Your leaders really need to know what you found, whether it's good or bad. It's important to engage them in the value of the work you're doing. APLU was really so impressed, and so were our funders and AIR, with the broad range of topics that our 10 institutions addressed. And it was really interesting to see how the findings were developed and then used on the different campuses. One of the things we want to address is the information overload. It's important to have a game plan when you're talking about this. Be mindful of the amount of information, both for yourself and to others, that you share out. Keep it simple. Stay focused on the value of the data and the analysis, the value to your students, and the value to the institution. Send a consistent message to your community of practice and to your leadership so that you get their buy-in, and then they start saying sending the same message to others. Data governance is helpful to simplify the process of accessing the information. Data literacy helps to improve the confidence that individuals have in using and seeing the data. Folks will generally have an easier time to understand the value of the data if they have the trust, but keep it simple so that the message is clear.
So information overload is a huge problem, especially with self-service analytics. How can we deliver the just-in-time training and information that our users need to understand how to work with our dashboards and how to find what they need when they need it? One way that we do this is through our dashboard guides, which provide information on what each dashboard can be used for, some example questions that can be asked by the dashboard. So we're also teaching them how to ask the right question, and information on how to use and reset the filter options. Despite the wide variety of dashboards and data that we do have available for our stakeholders, one of the things we hear most often is, you don't have the data that I need, which usually actually means I can't find the data that I need. This problem only gets bigger with the volume of information and dashboards available. So to help people find the data they need and navigate through our analytics system, we've developed a data navigator. This data navigator is role-based. So when you log in, you only see what's available to you. And it makes navigation easier by making the most critical links and buttons available to you in one place. So you can see at the top right here, they have an easy button to email support, to access our help guides or our how-to training videos. They can also explore what dashboards we have available either by topic area on the left or by folder. And we have a section where they can explore new resources that we've made available to them. And they can again have easy access to help. They've got a help button down at the bottom as well. And here you can see that when they do explore by topic in the tooltip, they have a link that takes them directly to the dashboard. On all of our dashboards, there's another data navigator icon that will take them right back to the data navigator. And we give them information about a short description of what the dashboard is, a short business use case, and then where it's located. And on some screens, we actually tell them when we have updated the dashboard for them. So finally, some recommendations for promoting data literacy. The first one is to take time to assess your data literacy, your data culture, and how mature it is. At most institutions, there's a wide variety of maturity levels across campus, and understanding where you have strengths and weaknesses is key to helping you plan a strategy to improve. Identifying opportunities and working with other offices and units to create consensus or at least agreement on how to move forward to fix those issues. And understanding major barriers that both you and your stakeholders are facing in promoting data use and a data literate culture. If you don't already have one, create or modify your data management structure and implement formal data governance. And finally, work to provide the training, support, and practice needed to promote effective data use and to develop a data culture at your institution.
So, key takeaways for building an effective data culture. How do we start to build that? At the institution level, we cultivate and solidify relationships with our champions. We build communities of practice and keep them engaged, not just with us, but with each other, getting feedback from these stakeholders and building that into our change process. Leaders should insist on using data for decision makings, and they also should be using data to make decisions. It's easy to get distracted with all the tools and all the data, so stay focused on the priorities and keep the North Star in the top of your mind. As Laura Lynn mentioned, make a commitment to data governance. It'll help make it easier to use data effectively. Educate your campus about why data governance is important and how it is used for understanding data. And as we plan for continuous improvement, ask people what they think, what they need on a regular basis. Make changes based on those changing needs, and particularly if you get feedback from your community. As mentioned earlier, you can host data summits so individuals can share or learn how data are being used, and you can create your own set of resources to share with your community.
So we'd also like to just leave you with some resources that have really especially helped me and also Denise in our journey in thinking about how to help our campuses in creating data literacy and a culture of data use and decision making. I highly recommend all of these books if you're interested in learning more about some of those practical strategies. If we go to the next slide, there's a list of some articles and resources that papers that can also help as you start to think about how to promote that on your campus. And with that, I think we'll be happy to take questions, right, Denise?
Yeah, I think we are.
Denise, we did have a question about providing the DMI, and we can send that to HLC for them to send out to everybody, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and absolutely, this does bring us to our question and answer portion of the program, which will be moderated by Dr. Destiny Quintero, VP of Education, Training, and Events at HLC. Just a reminder, please use the Q&A function here to submit your questions for our presenters. And Destiny, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, so we will work on sending out that resource as well. We see that there's a request actually for the updated slide deck, so if we can send that out as well. There is also a request here to put the book list up. I mean, it'll be in the slide deck that we send out, but if we can just put that up while we're doing a Q&A here, that might be helpful to some of those on the call. As of right now, there is a question about, we answer how big is the IR office?
No, I can answer that. So we do not just traditional IR, but also accreditation. But we have, so I basically have 4 teams in my office, 13 people. We have a 3-person team that does traditional IR type of reporting, answering internal and external data needs, etc. We have a 3-person advanced analytics unit that is a subgroup of our analytics and reporting. We have 1 person that's embedded with enrollment management but reports to us. And then we have 3 people in our institutional effectiveness team that supports assessment, our operations review process, student outcomes, etc. And then I have an institutional accreditation manager who is new in January, thank goodness, because I was going to quit with our comprehensive evaluation coming up without any support there, and then me. So it's a pretty big unit.
Yeah, sounds like it. Thank you. All right. Can you please provide a little more explanation about the data warehouses and data? Comes from someone who works at a small college, and she's just wondering if they would need to invest in a third-party solution.
So I really think that your needs should drive what your infrastructure structure is going to be. Don't get a data lake just because everyone else is doing it. Make sure that there's a need for it. Some folks get a data lake, which really is just a repository of raw data. And if you need to have that data analyzed for predictive analytics or something, then you probably need to have a data scientist on your staff in order to do that. If you don't have someone who can do that analysis, you may not want to get a data lake. Sometimes Tableau will create smaller, it could sit on a full data warehouse, but it might create smaller data sets to run off of because it runs more efficiently. So if you're using a complex reporting tool, that might dictate what your underlying structure would be. My personal experience is it's good to have a data warehouse where all of your different sources are integrated, there are standard definitions, anyone can access it through multiple tools. But again, you really want to make sure that your needs for your data drive what that infrastructure looks like.
And if I could just chime in, there are vendors available if you can't handle that in-house. EAB offers things, Blackboard offers things, Helio Campus offers a supportive data warehouse or data lake environment.
And we can connect you with other institutions also that have done this kind of work and gone through this exploration. So you might be able to learn a little bit of that from other institutions.
So sticking with the data warehouses, we have a question. How do you get comfortable with the accuracy and validity of historical data when creating a data warehouse? When is the decision made that it is clean enough?
So that, Laurelyn, do you want to tackle that?
I can take that in practice. So there are two different data sets I'm going to talk about. One is our official reporting. These are snapshotted data. So it is taken on a point in time that day. This is what the data looks like. If we're talking about that for our state reporting or our federal reporting, we want that to be as accurate as humanly possible. And then we're going to maintain that fixed file in the future so that anytime we need to go back and look at it, we're going to get the exact same number. Now, that's what IR is used to using and why a lot of us are like, okay, if it's off by one, it could be off by more, and we've got to, quadruple check everything. But with self-serve analytics, you're pulling data from your transactional data systems, your student information system, where things are changing minute by minute. Now, most of the time, you're only updating those systems at night, but it means that the data reflected in it can change from day to day. And that's anxiety producing sometimes. So when we validate our analytic data systems, we are looking to be within 1% of our numbers for our official data reporting at similar time periods. So we generally call that good. Most of our systems are within 0.5% or less, but that's what we consider good accuracy moving forward. But there may be some instances where you don't need that kind of accuracy, where it would be okay to say we're going to be off a little bit more and live with it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think having a range, a small number where you're saying, okay, within 1%, we're okay. We used to work for a system office, and I'd collect data from all the institutions in the system. And the flagship, who had, I think, like 12 or 13,000 faculty, and they were categorized as tenure track, or adjunct. And the IR director sent me a note that last year, the numbers they submitted, they were one off, and they wanted to correct it. And it just it was just too much work to go back and correct that. So we established a range of accuracy. And I think that in general, there's going to be some level of error in your data. You just have to live with it, as long as when you're looking at the numbers at the institution level, they're not wildly off.
All right. Other question? We have one more. Are there any suggested strategies for dealing with departments who are struggling to buy into these types of changes?
Antagonistic departments in higher education? I'm shocked. Like, really? Does that happen? I don't know. I would say that happens all the time. In my career, I have had departments or individuals that just like outright refuse to believe that their retention rate or graduation rate is what we say it is. And we often just have to sit down and go through, and it may be even at the unit record level, like, here are all of your students that make up this number, like, understand, let's talk about how we get to this. And also sometimes if you have departments that you need to work with, like functional offices that don't want to give access to their data, we try to work on building that relationship, meeting with them, hearing their concerns, showing them how we're using the data, agreeing on definitions. Sometimes they're concerned that you're not going to understand the limitations of their data because of their business processes. So they just want to share that and make sure you're going to communicate it with your end users appropriately. Other times, frankly, you need to get your executives to support you, and you may need them to be the heavy and the bad cop and be like, no, this is an institutional asset and we need these data for decision making, and you are going to make them available to these people for decision support.
So we have a commission on information measurement and analysis, and we get together in the summer just to talk about data issues. And this question actually just came up in our recent summer meeting. And there was one executive there who said, if you put the data out there for everyone to see, those naysayers who are not wanting to buy in with the data and the transparency, they will care because they want to make sure that everyone is seeing accurate, correct data on their department or their college. And so sometimes that transparency helps to motivate them to want to make sure that the data are accurate.
That is so true in my experience. We have more luck getting people to change bad business processes once we expose their data than in talking to them and saying, please, could you fix this?
Well, so along those lines, I think there is another question posed, so I'll come back to it here. But along those lines, I had a question. You said relative to your mission that being open and integrated is aspirational. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, because we have some data that's not open, right? At my own institution, we've actually had, in the last couple of years, we have some new leadership in a particular division that has actually requested that for competitive purposes, some of the data that we've had publicly available on our website for 30, 40 years is now behind single sign-on or has restricted access. I don't believe in that. I don't actually think that it's competitive data. We even have people sometimes who try to say that dashboards built on iPads data should be restricted, and that's public data. Mm-hmm. I think the more data there's no way that we can understand every single person's use case at the university. So the more data we can make publicly available, and they can say, yes, this data is important for me and my decision making, then we help build that data culture across campus. So that's what I mean by open. The integrated piece is not all of our data systems talk to each other. That's not a shock to anybody here in higher ed. We have lots of systems. They don't all interact. They're not all necessarily brought into our data warehouse or our data lake. And sometimes even if they are, they don't line up appropriately. We struggle with the definition of an academic department is different in our student information system than in our HR system and our finance system, which makes it really hard to merge that data together to get an accurate cost margin for an academic.
All right. Any suggestions about resources for establishing design and content principles for interactive dashboards? So a style guide of sorts.
Hire a great content designer. That's that we did. We actually have an analyst who used to be a graphic designer, and I highly recommend that approach. But the first thing to do is to see if you have a style guide or a brand guide with your communications and marketing department. And then you can start to look at and think about what you're going to do. I know it's not something we talked about, but having a design guide is really important for data literacy, because if you create dashboards and on every dashboard, the filters are in a different place or they're in a different order, or you are using all kinds of different visualizations. I have a really funny cartoon where that guy is holding his girlfriend's hand and he's turning to look at the beautiful woman behind him, where it's like, for the IR perspective, it's you holding hands with the tried and true visualization that most of your people understand, but you're trying to look back at like the 3D bubble chart or something. And so you really need to be careful and make sure that the visualizations you use, the fonts you use, everything is designed to make your user feel comfortable and to feel that they're oriented and understand what that dashboard is going to do for them. And a style guide really helps with that. That might be too weedy, but I geek out on that.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions for the attendees, but I'll ask two of my own relative to what you presented. You sort of mentioned the need to assess your culture before you start any of this. You need to know where you are to know where you're going. And then you mentioned there were 4 problems that you listed at the front of your presentation that can prevent an institution from increasing on this data maturity scale that you talk about. Of the 4 problems, you don't have access, you don't know how to access, you don't know what the data mean or what to do with the data. What is the one that you think, the question that stumps institutions the most? And if they had a problem in all 4 areas, where do you start?
So I think that the biggest problem we hear is, I don't have access. But as Laurelyn pointed out, they don't know that they don't have access. So it's a little bit of a communication problem, which is why I think the data governance is really important. The assessment tool that we talked about, the Data Maturity Index, is really based exclusively on individuals' perceptions. So it's not like, hey, I have access to everything, but I just don't know it. All they see is they don't have access to the data. And so it really informs, if it's a data governance committee or the chief data officer, this is a barrier to data literacy, whether it's a communication or whether they actually need access to something, we can figure that out, but it's a barrier that we need to address. And I think that's the purpose of doing that assessment, is to get the general ideas and perceptions of where people think their challenges are, and then chip away at that one challenge at a time.
All right, well, thank you for that. And my last question, and then we will let everyone go for the afternoon, and thank you for your contributions to this series. You talk, I really liked how you framed ownership, that it's the institutions who own the data and not individuals, that individuals are stewards, and you have to figure out who those stewards are. Once you do, when you determine who is responsible for the data, what does responsibility mean?
So part of the reason, I'm just going to step back into your question a minute. And when you talked about the institution being the owners of the data, the example is the financial aid data recently has been under a little bit of scrutiny, and some advice came from the federal government that made it unclear whether financial aid directors can share that information with the IR offices. And at some institutions, the financial aid director said, no, we can't do that. And at other institutions, they said, well, we need to do that because IR needs to report out based on financial aid information. in that situation, you don't want to have your IR director and your financial aid director, do rock, paper, scissors to figure out, or do an arm wrestle. It's the institution that has to decide, is it important enough that we have to allow this financial aid data to be shared despite what the regulations are? Or let's deal with it as an institution and push back on the federal regulations. So I do think there needs to be a position for the institution, because if that reporting doesn't go out, or if data is shared inappropriately, it's the institution that's at risk. What was the second part of your question?
What does responsibility mean?
So typically the data is collected. So using the financial aid example, so financial aid collects information on those students. And so a lot of that is very sensitive information. So they need to make sure that the data are accurate and can be used. And typically they use it for dispersing financial aid data to the student. So they need to make sure the information is complete and accurate, but they also need to make sure that it's secure. And then oftentimes, most institutions will keep it for years, but there might be some decisions made to say, we're not going to keep it for as long as we need to, because it is sensitive information. And when you are holding that information, you're always at risk of hacking. And so there might be some decision that we're only going to keep it for 5 years or 10 years. And other information, maybe housing information, might be kept for longer because it's less sensitive. So the stewards would be making those decisions and keeping the security of the data, and also informing others. If they're sharing this information with the IR office, they need to say, hey, the loan information from the federal government is incomplete, or, whatever challenges there are with the data.
I think, Denise, that you're exactly right. And I think this is where your formal data governance can also help, because there should be an appeal process. If an individual data steward has concerns and says, hey, there's risks about releasing this data, that's where your formal data governance committee can look at the risk and say, we agree, we understand there's a risk, but we're going to vote as an institutional body to release that data anyway. And they're going to accept that risk for the institution. So that can also help you when you get data stewards who really feel like they're data owners. And as a former registrar, I am all about FERPA, and I understand the compliance pieces. And I understand that, it can make you nervous to release that because you don't know that someone's going to use it appropriately. But you can't shut down all appropriate use just because you're worried that people are going to use it incorrectly. Then you're damaging the institution.
Very well said. And I think this last question is the perfect question to end on, because all of this work is difficult. How do you build in time for yourself for reflection, analysis, especially when you work in an office with limited resources?
So I would suggest a retreat with the staff or with your stakeholders, just taking time to meet with your stakeholders and reflecting on what are some of the challenges they faced over the course of the year, or what are the hopes that they have for the coming year. Laura Lynn, since you have a staff, how do you handle that?
Well, I think there are a couple different things here. So for my staff, like we have professional development time, or time where we say, hey, this is where you should be looking at skills or data or the next thing that you're going to do. But for other offices, I'll give you an example. At my previous institution, we started a new comprehensive student success program. We wanted people to look at and use data. But what we started with was, where can we help advisors save time. So advisors would come in and they would spend their first hour or two looking at email, looking at stuff, trying to figure out who do I need to talk to that day. And so what we were able to do is put together some data through early alert and other types of flags, etc., so that an advisor could come in and they would immediately have a list of here are the top 20 people you need to reach out to right now. And then they save time. So they could use that time to have meetings where they would focus on reviewing student success for different student demographics or things like that. So that can also be an approach, because I know we're all super busy. Blocking calendars, that also works. I do that a lot, where I block no meeting time, where I'm just going to sit and actually look at a problem and be able to think deeply about it.
Anything to add, Denise?
Nope, I think she's got it.
All right. Well, I'll turn it over to Babatunde to close this out. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Destiny. And thanks to all of our participants for joining us today. And a huge thank you to our presenters and our moderator, Destiny. I'd also like to thank Doyle Heitch, our meetings and events manager, for his ongoing assistance with this series. The series continues tomorrow at 1:00 Central Time with our fourth and final webinar, Equity-Minded Data Analysis. We look forward to having you join us then. Take care.